Today's comeback story is actually going to come to you from my living room. We have a nice storm out, and so no services today. Let me start actually by asking this question. What is the only book in the Bible that does not mention the name of God by name? There's only one book, and throughout all of its chapters, throughout all of its pages, God's name is never mentioned. Now, his presence is implied, and you can see his hand moving and working within the story, but he is never actually mentioned by name. And if you know the answer to that question, you know what book to turn to today. But anyway, we're going to be in the book of Esther. Now, our comeback story is not about Esther. Esther is a very familiar character. Most of us know her story, how she became the queen of Persia through different workings and dealings. But who I want to look at today is actually her cousin, and that's Mordecai. I have to confess, that I used to think, and I guess I never really thought about it, but I always thought that Mordecai was Esther's uncle. But actually, this Bible tells us, we'll see here in a second, that Esther was Mordecai's uncle's daughter, which makes them cousins, and so they were cousins. But he adopts her and raises her as his own daughter, so there's a bit of an age difference there between them. But that's what I want to look at today, is Mordecai's story. Just a little bit of background just as to where we are in Jewish history, just to kind of get our minds wrapped around this story. This is after the captivity, after the nation of Israel has been taken into captivity, and people are starting to return under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. People are starting to return back to Israel, and they're rebuilding the cities, the walls, the temple, all of those things. And so many people are returning under that leadership. But years and years ago, as you know, the nation of Israel and then Judah were taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and all the people that were of value to the Babylonians were taken. People that had some sort of intellect to them, or even beauty. Anybody that the Babylonians felt were of worth or value were taken back. Mighty men, smart men, intelligent men, wise men, whatever, and women were taken into captivity to use within their system of government. Reference, if you will, people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that were taken, and so that's who was taken. Not everybody was taken, but many were, and many were killed as well. So it was a terrible time in the history of Israel. But now we're in the time when people are starting to return under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. But not everybody returned. And our story today actually takes place in the land of Persia, which is not part of the Babylonian Empire. Many captives that were taken to Babylon were not treated very nicely. But Persia was a little bit different, and the people that were there could fit within their culture and their civilization and just kind of slide under the radar, if you will, and stay there. And many of them, established homes and businesses and a life for themselves there, even though they weren't in their homeland. And so that's what many people did. And so that's what our story is. The story of Mordecai and Esther are two people who were just quietly living still within the Persian Empire. Again, it was a time when they could have returned, but for whatever reason, and the Bible doesn't tell us, they chose to stay. And we'll see from our story, of course, this was the hand of God for them to be there to save the Jewish people. And so that's who we want to look at, is Mordecai, who was Esther's cousin. And, I'm not going to so much look at the story of Esther. I think most of us know that story, how that there was, the queen of Persia displeased King Ahasuerus, and don't know if I'm saying that right, but displeased him. And so she lost her queenship. And so they basically held a contest to see who would be the next queen of Persia. And Esther was taken up in this whole process, didn't volunteer. I don't think any of these women volunteered, maybe some, but was taken up in this process. And because of her beauty and composure, she won, if you will, and then becoming the queen of the Persian Empire, which God then used to save the nation. But again, I want to focus on Mordecai's role within this story. There are many people, many historians, Bible historians, Jewish historians, that actually feel like Mordecai, and this is nothing to take away from Esther and her story. She's an incredible woman in what she did. We thank God for her. But there are many that feel that Mordecai was actually the true hero of this story. So, but they both played a role, and they worked together in tandem, if you will. But I want to focus because this is where the comeback story takes place, if you will. Okay, and so let's start. We're going to actually jump ahead to chapter 2, and I'll read a few verses, and we'll go through and look at several verses within the book of Esther to help us get our story. But first, I want to take a look at basically their life, as I mentioned already. Okay, so we read in Esther chapter 2, and I'm going to start down in verse 5, where it says, "Now in Shushan, which was the capital of Persia, now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. And Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away when Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away." And so we see, how our story, how, they were carried away into captivity, excuse me, his family. And so now Mordecai is there with, in the Persian Empire, and still there, hasn't gone back. And it says, "And he brought up Hadassah," that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So again, they were cousins, "for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful." And so the scripture tells us that she was a very beautiful woman, beautiful to look at. And God uses that. And she was also a godly woman too. She wasn't just beautiful, she was also a godly woman. But Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for her his own daughter. So he raised her as his own daughter. And that's the first thing I want us to see, is that that's what he did. That in his life, here he was in this land for whatever reason, probably an intelligent man, a businessman, don't know. But he was an honorable man, because here was his cousin, and whereas he didn't really have a responsibility towards her, but he did. He did the right thing, and he took her in, and he watched out for her, he cared for her, provided for her. And I've mentioned this several times in church, that, in Bible times, for a woman to not have a family system behind them, it was a dangerous thing. It was a hard thing, a hard life, and there was just no way for them to provide for themselves, to take care of themselves. Many women did. Lydia, the seller of purple, we see in the New Testament. And so many women did, excuse me, but it was difficult. But then you add to that the fact that they were in captivity, so away from the Jewish homeland, away from their kindred and their family. And so this would have been a very difficult situation for Esther if it hadn't been for Mordecai doing the honorable thing and taking her into his family and under his wing to protect her. So that's the first thing that I want us to see about Mordecai, is that he was an honorable man doing the honorable thing. And so then we go on to read a little bit farther down through the beauty process. Esther gets taken up in this whole process because she was beautiful. That's the reason she was taken up. I don't believe that she volunteered for this. It just the king's court decided that we needed a new queen, and so anybody that was fair and beautiful, you come. And they were taken, basically, to live in the king's palace, and taken from their families, taken from their homes, and so whereas they got to live in the palace and there was beauty treatments and all these things, still you weren't free to go. And so, take that for what it will. But in verse 10 in our scripture, it said, "Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it." And so not only was he an honorable man, but we see his wisdom as well, as to keep their heritage away from the people around them. Hatred for Jews has been a thing since the beginning of time, and so it's no different now. And so Mordecai knew that they were a foreign people in a foreign land, and that there were many, especially those within the palace, who would not appreciate the fact that she was a Jew. And so we might look at like the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who openly said, we're a Jew, we're not going to take the king's meat, we don't want the king's portion, prove us, and we see what happened to them. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown in the fiery furnace. And so Mordecai knew these things, perhaps. I don't know that he knew that specifically, but he knew it wasn't safe, and so he encouraged Esther to not lie, but just not reveal that she was a Jew. And so we see his wisdom in keeping her, telling her to keep her heritage to herself and not let that. And so it would have been difficult. Jews lived differently. They had different ways of living. They worshiped Jehovah God, not the God of the Persians, the Medes and the Persians, okay? And then there's dietary laws, the way they dressed, the way they lived, the way they conducted themselves, the way, and so it would have been difficult for her to continue to live as a Jew, to follow her Jewish ways, and still, hide her heritage. But, that's what Mordecai encouraged her to do for her own safety and for her own well-being. And so we see that wisdom there. And then also we see his compassion, because now that she's been taken, he's raised her. I don't know how long. That doesn't give us a time frame. This whole story may be anywhere from 3 to 10 years. I'm not sure exactly. I didn't study that out too long, but it takes some time, this whole process that takes place. And how long Mordecai cared for Esther, I'm not sure. How young she was, and it doesn't tell us. But, it's obvious that he loved her and he cared about her, because then in verse 11 it says, "And then Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her." And so we see his compassion as well, how he would, this to him, this is his daughter and she's been taken. And so, he didn't just leave her go and go on to his own devices. Every day going by to see how, he wasn't obviously allowed in. He couldn't go in and see her personally, but every day he would go by the temple and by the house of the women to see how she was doing and somehow get report of. And so this was hard for him, difficult to have his daughter, if you will, his adoptive daughter, taken from him. And so this was a difficult thing, okay? And then we go down a little bit farther. Then in verse 19, we see that now things have changed a little bit, okay? Because it says in verse 19, "And when the virgins were gathered together a second time," so some time has passed from the first time that they were gathered. Some things has taken place. And as I said, I'm not so much getting into the story of Esther. I want to look at Mordecai's role. And so it says, "When the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate." And so now Mordecai actually has a position. He was blessed. God has blessed him as well. And that he now, to sit in the gate, and let me talk to you a little bit about that. A gate of a city was actually like the courthouse, if you will. It was where business was transacted. It was a public forum where people would come to bring business, to have decisions made and stuff. And to sit in the gate doesn't mean he was just sitting there. He was like in a sitting position. And so he had been elevated. Now, whether that was through the influence of Esther, we don't know, or if just his own dealings or whatever, but now he has a position of authority, if you will, a little bit, as he's sitting in the gate to rule matters and judge matters. And so now we see that God has blessed them. And so probably not an ideal situation to have his adoptive daughter taken like this, and he's still concerned for her, but now God has elevated him to this place where he sits in the gate, and so he can be a little bit more privy to what's going on. And that's going to be key, because the next thing that we're going to look at is where we see the first moving of the hand of God. Again, as I said, God's name is not mentioned in Scripture, but we see his hand. We see God moving in this story, okay? And so now Mordecai gets to sit in the gate, and people come and go, and businesses transacted, and decisions are made, and rulings are handed out, and that sort of a thing at the king's gate, okay? And so Mordecai is a part of this process. And while in the process of doing his position, whatever it was that he had, whatever his authority or whatever role he played in all of this, while he was there, something takes place, and Mordecai is privy of it. And at the time, it saves the king's life, King Ahasuerus' life, but we don't realize how much of a part it's going to play until farther on down the road. But God did. And so that's, sometimes it's hard for us when we're going through difficult situations in our life to actually see the hand of God, to see God working. And this is a situation where God is working, okay? In verse 21, then, it goes on. It says, "In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, or eunuchs as we might know them, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus." And so they had a plot to kill the king. And Mordecai was privy to this. And it says the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And that's important, okay? That this was recorded, that Mordecai was the one that uncovered this plot to kill the king. Now, at this time, nothing happened. Mordecai wasn't given, a Medal of Honor or any recognition or anything like that. But it was recorded in the King's Chronicles, and the Medes and the Persians kept really good records. And you can actually go back in time and read all of those things which tell about this story as well. And so this is important, And so slowly, little by little, things seem to be working out. He's there, and he hears this plot. He tells Esther. Esther certifies it before the king. These men are caught, and they're hung in the gallows, and this is recorded. And so we see the hand of God moving here in their life. At the time, they don't see it, they don't know it, they don't get it, but God is moving. God is doing a thing in their life, okay? And so we see that. Now's where the story takes its turn for the worse, if you will, when we get to chapter 3. And that's where the man by the name of Haman comes into play. Haman becomes the king's royal vizier, as we might know him today, his right-hand man, as who Haman is. And and so Haman is now elevated. There's the king, Ahasuerus, and then Haman. He's the vizier, and people have to do what he says. He's kind of like the go-between. That way the king can just go be lazy king and let Haman deal with all the people and all the matters and stuff. And so every day when Haman would come into the city or go through the gate, all the other people that were there at the gate, which included Mordecai, people of elevated position, they would all have to pay homage to Haman. Okay, it's almost like, oh, this is the king. He's more than royalty. They considered him to be like deity. This guy is like, a god to them, if you will. And so all the other people that were there had to bow down and pay homage to him. This is where Mordecai is like, you know what? I can't do that. I serve one God, Jehovah God, and the commandments say that, we're to have no other gods before us. And so Mordecai does not bow down. Mordecai will not bow down. And we can read about this. It says, and after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, and the Agathite, and advanced him and set him his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate, which would have been Mordecai, bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. And then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, why transgresseth thou the king's commandment? And it came to pass, when they spake daily unto him, he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matter would stand, for they had told him that he was a Jew. And so now they know he's a Jew, and so this has come out, and probably in the process day after day, you're not bowing. Why aren't you bowing? Well, I'm a Jew. I only worship Jehovah God. And so this matter comes out that he is a Jew. This is why I'm not bowing down to Haman. You're not my God. It's like, I understand you're the king's royal vizier, but I'm not going to bow down to you. I only bow to one God. And so, of course, this infuriates Haman. And so he concocts this plan. He goes before the king to set up a day, to cast lots, if you will. And they cast a lot on a certain day. And actually that day in history is in May, in March. I'm sorry, Purim. This is the holiday. The Jewish holiday of Purim is when they celebrate the victory that they have in the story. Didn't mean to give the story away, sorry, but anyway. And so this is actually coming up just in our calendar, because it's February now and next month is March, and so we're only about a month away from this. But they cast lots on a date, and it lands in March and stuff, that on that day then the people of Persia can rise up and slay all the Jews that are still within the kingdom. And so, of course, this causes an uproar amongst all the Jews. It's like, and it's all because, Haman hated the Jews. He hated Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow down. And it's easy for us maybe to want to blame Mordecai, but it's not really Mordecai's fault. He's only obeying the law of God. Again, not unlike Daniel obeying the law of God, which caused him to be thrown in the lion's den, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well, who got thrown in the fiery furnace, when they stood up for their principles and their Bible, that they were supposed to stand up for. This is what happened. And so this is the story that took place. And so Mordecai, he was a principled man. And so we see that he was honorable, he was wise, he was compassionate, blessed of God, and God's hand is moving. But we also see that he was principled as well. He wasn't going to bow down to this Haman and just give in and to make life easy. And because of it, then now the Jews have a sentence of death on them. And it wasn't an immediate thing. As I said, they cast lots on this day. This is when this is going to happen. And so now we see that Mordecai, then he becomes, in the New Testament, the Bible, there's a verse that says the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And so Mordecai was one of these effectual people. It says he goes out into the street by the king's gate. He can't actually go into the gate because he goes in sackcloth and ashes, as the Jews would do. And so he wasn't naked, but he was in sackcloth. But without proper clothing, proper attire, he could not go into the gate. And so he's outside the gate in sackcloth and ashes, just weeping and wailing, as many Jews were. And so we see he's crying out, begging for God, begging for mercy. Again, God's name's not mentioned, but we see them praying to Almighty God to deliver, to bring deliverance to them. And so Queen Esther, she hears about him out there, and so she sends clothes down. He's like, nope, not going to wear clothes. And he continues to wail. So she sends a messenger down to find out what's going on. And so then Mordecai gets his hands on the decree that was written. And again, the Medes and the Persians, they wrote everything down, and once it was written, it was law, could not be changed. And so that's the law of the Medes and the Persians. It just can't be changed. And so he gets a copy of this, sends it to Esther. Esther reads it. So now she realizes, okay, the Jewish people have a sentence of death in them, and this is not a good thing. She had not yet revealed herself that she is a Jew, that she's a part of this decree, that she could be slaughtered as well, okay? And so as you can see, this story has now gotten really bad. Not only does, Haman hate Mordecai, and they have the sentence of death upon Mordecai and all Jews. This is a bad situation. And again, we can't really blame Mordecai. You might want to. It's like, well, if he just bowed down, but no, we can't do that. And we as people today need to learn the same thing. We need to stand up for our biblical principles. Don't just go with the flow. We need to follow the rules of God and obey the laws of God, and do and the Bible tells us, as much as liveth in us, as much as be possible, I'm not quoting that right, I am so sorry, but live peaceably with all men. That's what God wants, as much as we possibly can. But if it crosses the line to where we break the law of God, then we can't follow that. And that's hard, I'm not talking about being, a dissident or anything like that, but we do need to stand up for what is right. We have to, and you can do it quietly and peaceably, and and not cause problems and stuff like that. And I don't believe that Mordecai wanted to, again, day after day, and then finally this is what happened, okay? And so it's a sticky situation, I get it, but stand up for your beliefs, stand up for your principles. That's what he did. And so he began to pray. And so then Esther, she's like, what can I do if I go in before the king? And this is how the law of the Medes and the Persians go. Esther says, if I go before the king, and if he doesn't ask me to come before him, and I just go see him, okay, I could be put to death on the spot, unless he had his scepter, the king's scepter, and he would have to put that scepter out. And if he did, then she could come in and touch the scepter, and everything would be okay. But if he was in a mood, and she goes before him, they could haul her away and have her put to death, okay? And so she doesn't want to go in. And I like the verses that he says, and we'll look in verse 4, or in chapter 4, down in verse 13. And so it says, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther. This is his answer that he gives to Esther about when she's kind of hesitant to go before the king. He says, think not within thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Okay? He says, listen, you're a Jew too. When we go, it's all of us. He says, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come into the kingdom for such a time as this? And so Mordecai's a believer. He is a faithful believer of God, because if you'll notice in the wording of that scripture there, he says deliverance from God is gonna come. He had full faith to believe that. And so he's telling Esther, he says, listen, don't think you're safe just because you're in the king's palace, okay? If you choose not to do this thing, deliverance will come from someone else. I like how, and so I love the confidence of Mordecai. Here he's got the sentence of death on his life, not just him, but all the entire Jewish nation within the Persian Empire. And he says, deliverance is going to come, queen, okay? Deliverance is going to come, cousin, my adoptive daughter. And so who knows, perhaps you were brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. That's why you were chosen as queen. That's why you were put in this situation, okay? And so now, and again, I'm not being harsh on Esther. It'd be hard. It's like, oh, if I go see this guy, I could die. But Mordecai wants her to understand, it's like, you know what? We're all going to die anyway if somebody doesn't do something. And I believe God is. And so let's do this thing. And so they work together in tandem. And so the queen, she gets herself all dolled up and everything. She goes before the king. He holds out the scepter. She touches it. And she lets him know. She says, listen, I'm a Jew too. And I'm going to be wrapped up in all this thing as well. And so what the king allows is for Mordecai and Esther to write. He can't change the law. That's the law of the Medes and the Persians. Haman's law is law. On this certain day, the day that the Jews celebrate Purim, it's in March. That's when the slaughter is going to take place. I can't change that. That's just how we do things, okay? But what the king did is he allowed Mordecai and Esther to write their own law and to put it in a decree that the Jews could defend themselves, that they could stand up for themselves and fight back. And so that's what they did. They made this law. But I love the fact that Mordecai was a believer. He believed that God would do this. And we can learn from that, you and I as believers in Christ as well, that when we're down, we may not have the sentence of death on our life, okay? We may not have people, hunting for us or gunning for us or whatever. But when things aren't going our way, when things are bad, when things are poor, when we're down and out, if you will, have the faith to believe, like Mordecai, to believe that God is working, that God is going to do something, okay? That's an amazing part of this story. And that's, to me, this is one of this is the crux of this whole story. When Mordecai says this, deliverance is going to come. He believed it. And so we need to be like that, you and I, to believe that God is going to do a thing. Life is hard. Life is difficult. Things happen in our lives, whether it's, by circumstance, happenstance, or our own doing or whatever, okay? And all of that's wrapped up in this story. But Mordecai did the right thing, and he had the faith to believe that God would do the right thing. And so Esther and Mordecai, they tag team, they work together. Mordecai goes throughout all the land and the Persians and telling everybody that, okay, here's the new decree. We can defend ourselves. We can, stand up for ourselves. And Mordecai gets all the people Esther gets all the people within the palace together. And so they work together in tandem, getting their law, their decree known to all the Jews within there, that on this day, again, the day that the Jews celebrate Purim, okay, that we can stand up and defend ourselves. And so that's what they do. They're faithful. And so not only are they believers, they're faithful to do what needs to be done. And so that's what they do. It came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court in the king's house. And so goes before him, tells him the story, and they set this whole plan in motion, okay? And then we get to chapter 6. Now we see the hand of God. As I said, God's name not mentioned, but we see his hand moving, okay? Purim is not, the day that the Jews are going to be slaughtered has not come to pass yet, but Haman has his law that's been written and published throughout the land. Mordecai and Esther have their law that's been published and written and published throughout all the land. And so everybody knows that this day is coming. And so then in chapter 6, we come to a day. It says, and on that night, the king could not sleep. And he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles. Remember that book? When Mordecai saved the king's life and nothing was ever done for him, but it was recorded, okay? And they were reading before the king, and it was found written. It just so happens, again, this is a big book, and it just so happens, this is the hand of God, that they came to the place where Mordecai saved the king's life, okay? And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigtha and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity have been done to Mordecai for this? And then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. And then the king said, who is in the court? And again, this is just providence of God. Well, they said Haman's out there. He said, well, bring Haman in. And so the king says to Haman, it's like, what should be done to honor a man that has served the king? And of course, Haman, he's thinking, well, this is me, and he's thinking, glory be, I've got the chance to kill all the Jews, and now the king wants to honor me. And he's just like, woo-hoo, look at me, how great I am, and stuff like that. And so that's what he's thinking. And so Haman says, well, you should put on the royal garment and the ring, and let him ride on the king's horse and parade through the city, and everybody bow down to him. And that's what he's thinking. He's like, yeah, that's right, I like that. He says, go find Mordecai and do that for him. Oh, you can just imagine how furious Haman was. But Haman knew that, that the day was coming that the Jews would be killed. And so we see that things are starting to turn around, okay? And so Esther prepares a banquet, and she's about to lay on the king, let him know that, hey, I'm a Jew, Mordecai is my cousin, he's a Jew, and everything. And so they have a banquet. Esther decides to have a banquet. And we read about the banquet in chapter 7. It says, and the king and Haman came to the banquet with Queen Esther. And so they come the first day, and she doesn't really tell the king what he wants. She says, we'll come back tomorrow. And so they have another banquet the next day. And so then finally the story goes that Esther says, listen, I'm a Jew, okay? Haman, this man, he hates us. And here's Mordecai, the guy that saved your life, quietly, okay? And Haman doesn't like him. And Haman's the one that wants all of our people killed. And so I'm a Jew. Mordecai, he's my cousin. He's a Jew. And we're part of that. Well, so then the king was wroth with that. And it just so happened that Haman had built a gallows to kill Mordecai 50 feet high, it says. And so the king says, just use that gallows. And so Haman is hung on his own gallows, the one that he had prepared to kill Mordecai with. And so this is where we see the comeback and the vindication in Mordecai's life. We see that God moved in such a way to deliver him. And so Haman, who was number 2 in the kingdom, okay, now and now he had to take Mordecai and parade him through the town and listen to all the people pay homage to Mordecai for saving the kings. And then through this banquet that Esther prepares, then Haman is hung on his own gallows. And so, I mean, it's sad to think, but that's the vindication. But now there's still this day, that the law of the Medes and the Persians can't be changed. And so there's still this day that the Jews are to be taken. And so it says in chapter 8 that the house of Haman, after he's taken, is actually given to Queen Esther. And so Esther and Mordecai then get Haman's house and his land, all of his property. So they've got that. And then in chapter 9 comes the part of the story when the battle's going to take place. And so we read in chapter 9, it says now in 9, it says, now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, the 13th day, the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to put in execution, the day the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was, and this is the key, in parentheses, as though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated him. And the Jews gathered themselves together in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people, and all the rulers of the province, and even the rulers like the Jews, okay? And all the lieutenants and the deputies and officers of the kings helped the Jews. Now watch this. Because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. And so finally the Jews were redeemed because they were afraid of Mordecai. And they're like, wow, this guy is something else, And God was working in and through Mordecai's life. And so, just think about that. Here he was, just quietly trying to live his life with his cousin, don't tell anybody we're Jew. And then they get caught up in this whole new queen thing, and Esther gets chosen as queen, and then the story with Haman, and just the whole thing. And so it's all come full circle. And so now Mordecai gets lifted up to be the king's royal vizier. He's second in command. He's second in charge. We see that he is lifted up to that place. And Mordecai was great in the king's house. His fame went throughout all the province, for the man Mordecai waxed greater and greater and greater. And we see his legacy that he left. Chapter 10 is just 3 verses, but it says, and King Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his powers and his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Medes and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of the brethren, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. And so, what a comeback story, to go from a humble servant living peaceably and quietly to having the sentence of death, thinking you're going to die, and to having this whole story come full circle to where now Mordecai became the king's royal vizier to one of the greatest kingdoms that this world has known, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, lifted up, and it brought deliverance to the Jewish people. And as I've said, the Jews to this day still celebrate the holiday of Purim in March to celebrate the victory that the Jews had over the Persians, the enemies within the Persian Empire that hated the Jews. And so, what a comeback story in the life of Mordecai. A lot of things. As I said, he was honorable, he was wise, he was faithful, he was a believer, he was effectual, fervent prayer, all these things about him. And he didn't allow these things to faze him. He just did the right thing in the face of adversity. And so that's my encouragement to us today. Whatever you're going through in your life, have the faith to believe that God will deliver you, that you will have a comeback story, that God will bless you as God blessed Mordecai in that day and age, because Mordecai did the right thing. And quite frankly, throughout all of these comeback stories, that's the key theme. That's a key element, is that through it, you do the right thing. Don't turn your back on God. Don't give up on God. Don't curse God, okay? Continue to do the right thing and allow God to move in and through you and the people around you to bring your comeback story to fruition. I hope this has been a blessing to you, and we'll see you all back in church next Sunday. Amen.